Benjamin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And it's good to see you in person.
Yeah, it's a pleasure being here in this beautiful park.
Yeah, I've interviewed you a couple of times. You have also have very strong opinions against imperialism. That's exercise that you think is the United States. But I always wondered, how come you developed these ideas? What made you the person you are today?
Well, a lot of things. I mean, I'm in my 30s and I went to college during the financial crisis in the United States. And for my generation, many people thought that there was basically no hope in the future. We were told that jobs may not exist. There was also the issue of student debt. We grew up during the Great Recession, right? And furthermore, in the United States, there are a lot of problems, and we can see them getting worse over time. More poverty, more and more homelessness. So, you know, we've heard this idea for many years that in the United States, each generation lives better than the previous generation. Well, that's actually not true for my generation. In fact, the standard of living for our parents was higher than the standard of living for our generation. And in fact, not only has the standard of living dropped, but even the life expectancy has dropped. So among my generation, people live for fewer years, they live less than the older generation. So we're in a moment of political and economic crisis in the US. And meanwhile, you can look at other countries, in particular China, which is the exact opposite. Poverty is falling, economic development is incredible, and the way that China has been able to do this is through a socialist system, a unique system of socialism with Chinese characteristics.
What is your sense of the kind of orderliness or disorderliness that we're seeing in this world? I feel, because we do this kind of discussion all the time, I feel sometimes there is a strong sense of helplessness, that you know something is wrong, you know something has to be done in a certain way, but it's going to the opposite direction. Do you think we're entering a period of time of great disorientation? And, you know, what could be the danger if that is the case?
Well, unfortunately, I do think we're entering a very turbulent time. Many of these societies in the West are becoming less and less democratic, and it's precisely a product of the deregulation of the financial sector and the incredible power of capital. Now, I think people have pointed out that, yes, in China there are wealthy people, but wealthy people do not control the government, whereas in the West, wealthy people do control the government. We have a small handful of oligarchs, billionaires, who are getting richer and richer and more powerful. And in countries in particular like the United States, but also in some European countries, they have incredible power over the political system. So the Supreme Court in the United States, through Citizens United, was a ruling that said that there is no limit on campaign contributions from big companies, from banks, from wealthy interests. What that means is that essentially, if you're running for office as a politician, you have to do what these large corporations, these large financial interests want. It's the opposite of the Chinese system. And the Chinese system, the big companies, they do exist, but they do not control the government. In fact, they're regulated by the government. Whereas in the US, they control the government. They essentially, they lobby. Lobbying is legal, whereas in many countries this would be illegal. So what we have is this crisis where people don't have influence on government policy. In fact, there are scholars in the United States, including at Princeton and Northwestern University, who did a study. And the study quantitatively showed that average people have zero influence on policy making. Instead, it's lobbying groups and big money groups. So that's why people feel so angry on policy.
But they can vote?
Voting does not mean a democracy. I mean, you can have
elections, as a devil's advocate.
Yeah, I mean, a democracy means rule by the people. But just because you have elections doesn't mean that the politicians who win the elections represent the people. And we can look at many different policies and see that there are policies like universal health care that are very popular, or free higher education. These are very popular policies, but they're not implemented because they're not profitable, because the politicians who win the elections, despite the fact that people vote for them, they don't represent the popular will of the people. And that's why when China talks about whole process people's democracy, it actually can be a true form of democracy, because the reality is that the policies implemented by the Chinese government are more reflective of the interests of the Chinese people than the policies implemented by the US government. So it doesn't matter if you have elections if the politicians who are elected don't actually represent the people. And we've seen this very clearly in the United States. And that's why we're seeing this rise of these very far-right populist movements. And it's because there is a lack of alternatives.
The thing is, look, Donald Trump was in office And 4 years later, he still has so much popular support despite the kind of performances that many people judge to be disastrous. Why are people not making the kind of realizations that they need to be? They're not coming to terms with.
Everything that people learn about what's going on is mediated through the media, right? And the media in the US in particular is very partisan, it's very biased. You have very conservative media like Fox News, you have media that's affiliated with the Democratic Party like MSNBC. Everything is filtered through these lenses. And what we see is that life for many people is getting worse. For average working people, of course, if you're wealthy, you can live very well in the US. But for average working people, their wages have been stagnant since the 1970s. We see that you probably won't have Social Security. My generation is being told there will be no retirement funding, no pensions. Healthcare is extremely expensive. Education is prohibitively expensive. So you have all of these problems. Meanwhile, you have more racism, violence, instability. So people can see that their lives are getting worse. And yet they have two choices in the political system. You have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The Democrats are incapable of providing alternatives because they ostensibly say they want to provide better policies for working people, but they're also beholden to the big money interests. So they have this contradictory policy where they say they want to give us more education and healthcare, but they don't do it. And then you have Republicans, and what is their response? They scapegoat immigrants. They blame feminism. They blame China for everything. They're now, we have this drug issue. They blame China, which has nothing to do with it. In fact, the drug issue in the US was caused by big pharmaceutical corporations, including Purdue Pharma, which faced dozens of lawsuits for basically giving money to doctors to encourage them to overprescribe medicine like OxyContin, which got people addicted, and then they get addicted to other forms.
It's the consumption that's the problem.
And it's the system, absolutely. And so people are looking for answers, and people like Donald Trump give them easy answers. They're not the correct answers, but easy answers. The problem is China. The problem is immigration. And if you don't have answers from the Democratic Party that convince people, they will look for these kind of populist answers. And it's a very dangerous moment.
Do they not count the money in their pocket when they turn to the Republicans? I mean, if Trump did such a bad job during his time with the economy, do people not say, oh, my wallet got tighter, so I'm not going to vote for Trump? But it seems that they do.
Well, you should keep in mind a few things. First of all, in US elections, in presidential elections, only about half of adults vote. This is a very important fact, it's often forgotten. In midterm elections, every 2 years, only around 20% of adults in the US vote. Many people do not feel that the political system represents them. There's a lot of apathy, and it makes sense. I mean, a lot of people say, why would I vote? Because nothing will change. It's very common to hear that. So people feel disenfranchised. Whereas in China, we're told that China is supposedly undemocratic, but in reality, the Chinese system is significantly more representative and more efficient. You don't have to spend all of this time with this interminable battle where you have these laws that are passed that are thousands of pages long. And why is that? You look at these laws passed in the US because every politician tries to throw in their own, what they call pork barrel politics. So we have something in our state that we want to throw into this law. So what happens is these laws get passed that are 4,000 pages long. No one even knows what's in these laws because in order to get the law passed, the Republicans and Democrats have to fight to say, we're going to put this in and put this in. But who's left out of it? The people are left out of it. These laws are not passed for the people. These laws are passed for special interest groups, for a bank, for a military contractor, for some certain company. And again, so the reality is that we talk about the economy doing well. Well, okay, maybe GDP growth is high in the US, but that's because one, federal debt is last year it was 6.2% of GDP, the deficit. So federal debt is skyrocketing. Furthermore, it's also because, yes, GDP is growing in particular in the financial sector, in the military sector, making weapons and ammunition. But if you look at the actual good paying jobs that people want, industrial jobs, teachers' salaries, those are stagnant or they're declining.
So what kind of inspiration are you looking for by being in China, especially by coming to the Wuyi Forum? Do you think you have found something that may give answers to some of the dilemmas that you talked about?
Yeah, I think China has a model for the entire world. Its economic model is absolutely incredible. The way that China has been able to develop through its unique system of a socialist market economy, dealing with some of the issues that I've been speaking about, where capital does not control the government. It's the opposite. There are private companies, there are wealthy people in China, and they're allowed to operate, but they don't control the government. Now, furthermore, I think China is making huge progress in new technologies that are very important for the green revolution, for transitioning away from fossil fuels. Climate change is an issue that affects everyone. It doesn't respect borders. And climate change is getting worse every single year. And China is the world leader in 3 of the most important cutting-edge technologies, the new 3 technologies of batteries, of solar panels and wind turbines, and also electric vehicles. And unfortunately, the response of the US is saying that we don't want electric vehicles from China. We don't want to collaborate with China.
National security.
They say, yeah, national security is always the excuse they use to justify protectionism and trade war policies. But instead of engaging in this aggressive kind of trade war against China, the US should be collaborating, and we should be working together in order to transition away from fossil fuels, to transition toward green, renewable energy.
To link it back to the traditional Chinese culture, I'm sure you have gotten a first-hand view of it. You know, it's a very vast subject, I know, but from bits and pieces that you have come across, that you have experienced, what made it possible for China to do the things that you just said?
Well, China is so unique because it has 5,000 years of history. It's very different from the US, which only has a little over 200 years of history. And unfortunately, in those 200 years, the US has, for almost the entire history, been at war. Whereas China, in recent history, has not been at war. It's been at peace, and China is one of the few countries that has been able to develop peacefully. And I think China is really remarkable in the way that it's been able to integrate with the 2 integrations, Marxism, socialism, with its unique history, its unique culture, and China has shown that you can integrate them. They're not contradictory. And I think one of the unique ways that China has done that is it's shown that throughout the history of Chinese civilization, the people have always been fighting for their rights, fighting for freedom against oppressors, against the old dynasties, and
the right to revolution.
Absolutely, the right to rebel. And I think if you go back throughout Chinese history for thousands of years, you can see all of these rebellions, and they eventually lead to the 1949 revolution, which has its historical origins in these past rebellions, the Boxer rebellions and many other. So I think China is unique in that sense, and I think other countries can learn from that.
Thank you so much. Very interesting, very thought-provoking discussion. A lot to unpack, but time is very limited. Editor-in-Chief of Geopolitical Economy Report, Benjamin Norton. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.